Pasok, pasok, pasok! Inside, inside!
We order you, have your cop to leave the area immediately, right now.
I'm Venetia Rainey, and this is Battle Lines.
Regardless of who stands with Israel, Israel will fight until this battle is won.
I've made wartime decisions. I know the choices are never clear or easy for the leadership.
I just find bombs and I find dead people, but it's a really scary thing for me.
In this episode of Battle Lines, we join the Telegraph's Asia correspondent Nicola Smith for a special dispatch on board a Filipino ship patrolling the front line of a simmering conflict in the South China Sea. Then we speak to economics reporter Melissa Lawford about China's gold-buying binge and why it means tensions in East Asia could be on the cusp of heating up even further. It's Friday, May 3rd, 2024. We begin this episode with a special report from Nicola from the South China Sea. She joined the Filipino Coast Guard on an expedition to give supplies to fishermen out in the Scarborough Shoal, an area claimed by both China and the Philippines. Over to Nicola.
It's early morning on Monday the 29th of April, shortly before 6 a.m, and we have arrived at the main port of Manila, the capital of the Philippines. We've just boarded a Coast Guard ship, the BRP Bagakay, and we're going to be spending several days on board this ship, which I'm a little bit apprehensive about. That's a long time at sea. And we are heading out towards the Scarborough Shoal, which is one of several disputed features in the South China Sea. China claims the shoal as its own territory, and so does the Philippines. And it does, in fact, lie within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. The shoal has been the scene of several confrontations between the Chinese Coast Guard and the Philippine Coast Guard, and also fishermen. Filipino fishermen say that they have been denied access to the shoal by the Chinese Coast Guard, and this was once very rich fishing waters for them, and they say that they've really lost a lot of their livelihoods because now they've been denied access. So that's it. We have loaded up the ship with supplies, with food and water and extra toilet paper, and we're now sailing out of the port. We're leaving the high rises and the traffic jams of Manila behind and heading out to the open sea. It's about 3 p.m. now on Monday the 29th of April, and we've been joined by a second ship. It's the BRP Datu Bangkok. And this is a ship that's owned by the Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources. And so our ship's job is to protect this one. It's carrying humanitarian supplies like food and fuel for the fishermen who are out near the Scarborough Shoal. And so our Coast Guard ship will be accompanying it to make sure that it can do so without any problems. And we're just sailing past Mariveles, and in the distance is Mount Samal. It's very beautiful. It's a hot sunny day, although it's really hot. The Philippines is having a bit of a heat wave just now, and it's beautiful scenery so far. I'm standing on the bridge of the ship now. The stars are lovely, and we had a gorgeous golden sunset a couple of hours ago. It's all very peaceful. The waves are lapping against the side of the boat. And we've been told that we're likely to arrive in the waters near the Scarborough Shoal around 8 or 9 a.m. in the morning. As we come closer to the Scarborough Shoal, then obviously the Chinese Coast Guard vessels operating in that area will know that we are coming. And the crew on our ship say that their reaction is entirely unpredictable. There have been confrontations in the recent past. Chinese vessels have opened fire with water cannons on the Filipinos. They have encircled them. They have harassed their boats. Fishermen have said that they've been blocked from entering fishing grounds there. There was a recent incident where the Chinese actually built a floating barrier around the reef using buoys and rope, and then the Filipinos cut that barrier away. So there is a history of confrontation, of clashes, of diplomatic rows over the Scarborough Shoal, and both sides accuse each other of provocation. It's 5:20 a.m. on Tuesday the 30th of April, and dawn is just breaking. Everyone's just starting to stir from their sleep. It wasn't too rocky, it was relatively pleasant, and I woke up to see the crew kind of looking out the side of the boat, and on the horizon there is a grey ship, and they've said that it is a Chinese ship, but that they can't identify it because it's turned off its automatic identification system. So it's still relatively far away. A short update now, it's about 6:10 a.m. and the ship is now closer. It's visibly white, not grey. It's definitely a Coast Guard ship, a Chinese Coast Guard ship. Its number is 3105, the crew have discovered. It hasn't communicated yet with our ship. They say that normally happens about 24 nautical miles from the Scarborough Shoal. We're currently about 38 nautical miles from the shoal. And it seems to just be observing us. We're observing it. We're looking at each other, but still relatively far out. You can almost see the writing on the side of their ship. Can't quite read it. And there's still a plume of smoke coming out. And that's it for now, really. It feels tense. It's gone very quiet. Everyone in the bridge is just staring intently at the ships. It feels a little bit tense now. We're just very close to the Chinese Coast Guard ship, and we're just still watching each other. We're being separated from the boat that we have been accompanying. It's now got about 3 Coast Guard ships very close to it. We're a little bit back, going slow. We've just all seemed to have come to a bit of a standstill.
China has indeed stable sovereignty over the islands, including Huangyan Island in the South China Sea and the adjacent waters. We order you, at your cost, to leave this sea area immediately, right now. Over.
China Coast Guard vessel 3305 is Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources NMUV 3004 BRP Datu Bacau. Based on the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, wherein China is party to, relevant countries were awarded a 200 nautical mile EEZ. You are way beyond 200 nautical mile EEZ of your country. Please review your chart.
Okay, this is pretty aggressive. So Chinese boat 21558, which has been trailing us also since 5 a.m. They're now trying to come between us and our supply boat, the BFAR boat. They're close enough that they're really close. I would say maybe about, I don't know, 75 meters or so. At the moment, we're just literally surrounded by Chinese Coast Guard ships. They are trying to cut us off, speeding up and just slicing across the water in front of us. And the last maneuver almost caused us to bump into their ship. All of the Filipino crew members were getting ready to throw down protective measures.
So we're very close to the shoal, but you can hear in the background radio communications between the crew members at the bow and the bridge, and there's what appears to be a barrier in front of us. Our ship has sent out a drone to inspect, but it looks from a distance like it's a floating barrier with maybe white buoys, and there is one ship to my right, which I've been told is a maritime militia ship, not the Coast Guard, and then a Chinese fishing vessel. It's very quiet just now. We've just switched off or turned down the engine.
and we're just approaching very slowly, trying to work out what this barrier is that's been erected between us and the shoal. The supply boat is some way behind us, but they've been putting out a call to Filipino fishermen in the area to come and pick up food and fuel that they've been carrying from the coast. So after pulling back about half an hour ago from cat and mouse manoeuvres and from constantly trying to block us and cut us off, the Chinese Coast Guard have pulled up alongside, and if you see behind me, they've been firing this water cannon for about 5 minutes. This is a fresh tactic that they have deployed in the past 5 minutes or so. It's one of several tactics that they use to try and block Filipino vessels, the Coast Guard, from getting close to Scarborough Shoal, which they are claiming as their own territory, even though that's been challenged in an international court of law, challenged successfully. So the Filipino Coast Guard ship that we're on just now is calmly waiting, not going back, but just calmly waiting for now. Have one boat penning us in with a water cannon, and we have another which is in front of us and it's blocking us off. So the water cannon is getting closer, and I think we're going to have to retreat back. So it's just dripping on the canopy above us, and you just keep going. It's pretty strong. Just shielding my phone here so that it doesn't get too wet, but you can really hear. Oh, yeah, that's quite a downpour. Real deluge. Everyone's coming in. It's getting too aggressive, so everyone's coming in the door from the deck. You can hear the chaos. We're just sheltering in the corridor right next to the deck as the water comes down. The crew are coming in with their hard hats on, rushing through the door. These cannons can get really powerful. They can really cause an injury. We're just sheltering now under a canopy that's being completely destroyed. This is an area of the ship where we've been sitting, chatting, working, resting, and there's some serious damage that's been done. It's very significant damage. Deluge. BBC has just got soaked. So we're all a bit wet now as the water cannon was put out very fiercely for at least 5 minutes. We had to rush inside the boat. We were sheltering inside a little corridor, and it was a very powerful water cannon. And it's so powerful that it's actually destroyed the canopy that was above the deck where we've been sitting for the past day. It's just come down with bits of plastic everywhere. And a light is coming down over. So this is wreckage here. That's how powerful these water cannons are, and you don't want to get caught under them because they can cause serious injuries. What did the Filipino Coast Guard say?
They were telling the Chinese to stop the water cannon.
Okay.
Yeah. They were endangering the vessel and the personnel.
Right. Well, there's a lot of damage out there, isn't there?
Yeah. The railing here is damaged also.
The railing
of the ship on the left side, it's damaged, heavily damaged actually. You can't pass through here anymore.
I think reflecting on this encounter with the Chinese Coast Guard, I would say that while it's rare to attack a Philippine Coast Guard ship with water cannons at this particular location in the South China Sea and at the Scarborough Shoal, and we went very close to the shoal, that overall encounters like this are not unusual at all in the South China Sea. China is acting with increasing swagger to assert its claims to this part of the world, and this incident shows that it's prepared to use aggression and dangerous moves to control access to what it believes to be its territory. Really, this was a stark reminder of how this kind of brinkmanship really puts the South China Sea in danger of becoming a global flashpoint. Really raises the risk of conflict and of accelerating tensions, whether accidentally or deliberately. But the Philippines also has another purpose in going on these missions, and that is that they want to show that they're not going to back down, that they're not going to be bullied by China and pushed out of waters that they say are their own. They want to challenge China's claims, and they really portray themselves as David against this Goliath. If you ask why is the South China Sea relevant to somewhere like the UK, first of all, it's a resource-rich area which has vast reserves of untapped oil and gas, but it's also the location of a huge network of trade routes through which trillions of dollars of goods travel every year. It's crucial to supply chains, and the global impact would be huge if any country were to try and exert economic coercion tactics here. This region is now on a hair trigger. If there is a major escalation that begins with a maritime confrontation, then it has potential to draw in the United States and its allies, which would include Britain. And frankly, nobody wants conflict. And Filipinos here that I've spoken to, they just want peace. And it's the same around this region where there are potential flashpoints. He really just wants to live a peaceful life.
Thanks so much for that dispatch, Nikki. It was absolutely fascinating to hear you out on the high seas. Before we dive into your sort of reflections about what this means geopolitically and all of that, can you tell me a bit about what life was like on board a boat for 5 days?
Overall, it was a really unique experience, and the crew on the ship could not have been more accommodating and welcoming, and they did everything to make our passage as comfortable as possible. It was quite a small ship. It was 44 meters in length, and there were 12 journalists in addition to the crew, and they very kindly let us use their mess. We had our equipment all over their mess table. We were working there. One of the officers gave up his room for the female journalists, so there were 4 women, and he very kindly gave us his room, which meant that we had 2 bathrooms between 12 of us, which was absolutely fine. It just felt like being on an unusual camping trip. And this being out at sea was very calming most of the time. We saw some beautiful sunsets, some amazing stars. We slept under them for a couple of nights, and it was actually quite soothing to go to sleep.
Now that you're back on dry land in Manila and you're reflecting on it a bit, how significant was that attack? Does this kind of thing happen all the time?
Yes and no. China is acting with increasing aggression across the South China Sea. And so there have been multiple incidents, because there are multiple areas of the South China Sea that are contested by many countries, and China claims sovereignty over almost the whole of the sea. But there are competing claims from different Southeast Asian countries, among them the Philippines. And so there are often confrontations in different forms between Chinese vessels and vessels of other countries, including the United States. We've also seen some confrontations between military aircraft from the US, Australia, Canada, and Chinese over this area. But at the Scarborough show, the Philippine Coast Guard told us that at this particular show, that they were very surprised at how aggressive
the Chinese Coast Guard had been towards the Philippine Coast Guard, that this was the first time they had seen such brute force used against a Coast Guard vessel. There have been other supply vessels who have been water cannoned in that area, but they were very taken aback that China had turned on a Philippine Coast Guard vessel. And they saw this as a serious escalation, that they saw this as an escalation, that this water jet was potentially lethal. So they have strongly protested against China's very aggressive actions against them.
And what do we know about the Chinese boats that were harassing you and water cannoning you? Are they state boats? Is this the Coast Guard? You mentioned maritime militia. Who exactly are these people, and what kind of authority do they have from the main government?
So when we first spotted them, it was about 5 a.m. in the morning. There were 2 Coast Guard ships on the horizon, and this then grew within an hour or so to about 5 Coast Guard ships. There was also a Chinese naval ship in the background. It didn't engage with the Philippine Coast Guard. It was only the Chinese Coast Guard that did. When we got to the Scarborough Shoal, within sight was also a ship that the Filipino crew identified as a Chinese maritime militia boat as well. And they said that others were in the region.
So we can safely assume this is state-sanctioned harassment.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, China has been very clear that it wants to assert its sovereignty in this area and in many other areas of the South China Sea. And this is the way that it's doing it. And it's doing it with brute force. It's what we saw out there were some very dangerous maneuvers on behalf of that were carried out by the Chinese. The Filipinos were only taking evasive action. They were trying not to collide with the Chinese Coast Guard ships, which were cutting in front of us. At one point, one Chinese Coast Guard ship was within 5 meters of our bow. The captain of the ship we were on, he took evasive action. He slowed down. He was doing U-turns. He was weaving in and out of these Chinese Coast Guard ships. They were speeding up beside us. They were veering in towards us. They were making it look like they were about to ram us. A ship that was accompanying us was actually rammed. We weren't, but we came very close to collision on several occasions. The water cannon that they then used against the ship was fired with, it could have been potentially lethal. Somebody could have been killed or seriously injured. When we saw the damage that it made to the ship after just a few minutes, the awning, a plastic awning on the deck of the stern had collapsed. There were jagged pieces of plastic everywhere. A steel barrier on a passageway, a walkway that we've been using had just been rammed into the hull of the ship. And you can only imagine what that would do to a human body. And it was, our crew were very skilled. Our captain was extremely skilled and managed to avert any kind of disaster. But if it had not been for the professional behaviour of the crew, somebody could have been very seriously hurt or worse.
What has China said about this event?
So they gave their own version of events. They didn't make any comment about their own provocative behaviour. China always blames the Filipinos for provocative action, and the Filipinos likewise accused China of provocation. But from what I saw with my own eyes, there was only one side that was doing the provoking, and that was turning to very dangerous and violent actions to enforce its will and to enforce its claims on that area. Both sides are contesting the sovereignty of the area, but that's not something that should be solved by brute force.
One final question. It's really interesting that the Filipinos are running these sorts of trips, because it was essentially a press trip, and the Filipino administration have changed their stance on this, haven't they?
The Filipinos want to take journalists out because they want journalists to be eyewitnesses to China's actions in the South China Sea and to report on China's aggressive behaviour. And they basically want to counter Chinese propaganda on
what happens between the two sides when there is a confrontation. They want to be transparent. They want the world to know what's happening in this part of the South China Sea.
Thank you so much, Nicola Smith, our Asia correspondent in Manila. Now, the South China Sea is not the only place where Beijing is making waves. Amid a major gold buying drive, they're also setting off alarm bells in the markets. I spoke to Melissa Lawford to find out more. My eye was caught this week by a story you did about China buying lots of gold. Do you want to start me off by telling me what alerted you to this trend?
Thank you. Well, there's quite a lot going on here with this story, but the thing that ultimately alerted me to it this week is we had a report from the World Gold Council, which came out earlier this week, and that showed the People's Bank of China has bought 27 tons of gold in the first 3 months of the year. Now, China's central bank has been buying gold for quite some time, but this data at the start of the year means their spree is now 17 months long, and that's a record for China since at least 2000. And that, I think, is quite a big alarm bell.
And you say alarm bell. How does that amount of gold compare to what other countries buy in, a year?
So China central bank started buying gold in October 22, and that means they've now been buying for 17 months long. And they now have total reserves of 2,626 tons. That's worth about $170 billion. And that's 16% more than when they started. And it's also a record high for the People's Bank of China. They have never had this amount of gold in reserve. To put that into context, I think China now has the 6th largest gold stockpile in the world. It's quite a long way behind the US, which holds about 8,000 tons, which is around $600 billion. You can see that's quite a lot more, but the US has the dollar, it's the world's reserve currency. So that's to be expected. The UK, we're looking a little bit small on this front. We've got around 310 tons. So that's about 23 billion. So you can see where China sits within that. What's remarkable about this, they've been going for 17 months. That's their longest ever. Previously, I think their last longest gold buying spree was in 2015, and it was about 15 or 16 months. But here, there is just no sign that they are slowing down. And what's really crazy is that they're doing this at a time when gold prices are close to record highs. The price of gold hit a record high earlier in April, and it's now around $2,299 per troy ounce. That's up about 14% compared to a year ago. Basically, they are on this spree at the most expensive time that they could be trying to do this. It is costing them a lot of money, and that really paints the picture of the sense of urgency here. They are worried about something, and they're racing to build up these stocks.
Well, let's get straight into what they're worried about then. Our listeners will obviously know that gold is one of those safe haven commodities, and when things go a bit haywire, that's where people flock to. What's China worried about?
There's sort of two things happening here. Everyone's probably been reading in the press about how China has this long-term aim to challenge the dominance, the total hegemony of the US dollar in the world as the global reserve currency. It's what central banks hold cash in. And that's an incredibly powerful thing. China's got a long-term aim to challenge that. It's got a very, very, very long way to go with the renminbi. But there's a kind of argument that if you want to move away from the dollar, the dominance of the dollar, the kind of segue to do that is move into gold first. So maybe that's a kind of long-term aim. But before that, there's a much bigger short-term issue here. And we can see this very clearly. This is a response to the sanctions imposed on Russia in the wake of the war in Ukraine. So when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 22, the West, the US, responded by massive sanctions, massive financial sanctions, which wiped out Moscow's dollar reserves. That's about $350 billion of Moscow's dollar reserves that just got frozen, were sanctioned. And that was a real watershed moment. That hadn't been done on that scale before. And, what analysts are saying is policymakers in China and President Xi Jinping sees this and thinks, well, we're pretty vulnerable to this. China is actually more vulnerable to this than Russia because China's a lot more dependent on world trade. Russia's a bit more isolated. China's doing a lot of trade in dollars. What we've seen is this real effort from policymakers in China to try and insulate China from sanctions like that. So what they're doing is, at the same time that they're buying up gold, the central bank is buying up gold, it's also reducing its holdings of US treasuries. And that means it's on a trajectory. It's still quite exposed to the dollar system. It's still partaking a lot in this, but its aim is to kind of build a degree of insulation. So if the West were to impose a freeze on its global currency reserves, it wouldn't hurt it so much.
It's hard, isn't it? Because it all feels hypothetical and tied up very much in a lot of bellicose rhetoric, frankly. And we hear a lot of it from China repeatedly, often with the same words and the same formulations. And you become, in a sense, particularly, I think, working in the media, a little bit inured to it. You start to sort of shrug it off. Oh, that's how China would respond. That's what China would do. So it's interesting to look at some of the sort of, I think, what some people might consider the sort of background workings in terms of them buying gold, protecting their trade. Those are the sort of concrete signs that perhaps don't always make headlines, although they did this week, that maybe we should be focusing more on, that might give us a bit more of a concrete sign as to where things are going, because the rhetoric can be hard to pass sometimes.
Definitely. China's really putting its money where its mouth is, buying gold like this. I really do think it is an alarm bell, and I really do think we should be paying attention. I suppose another conversation alongside this is, what does it tell us about the effectiveness of sanctions, and what are we going to have left to do? If China does build up a degree of immunity, it's a limited number of levers that the West can pull. And if they're already limited in their capabilities already, as we see with Russia, if they become more limited, I don't know where that leaves us. It's quite scary.
When you reflect on the impact that sanctions have had compared to what we probably wanted them to have on Russia, what lessons can we take from that in the West in terms of if we wanted to try and deter or punish China from doing something that we felt broke international law and order?
It's a very difficult question. In a lot of ways, the sanctions against Russia have been effective. They are squeezing their economy, their war machine, but they haven't stopped anything. And Russia is finding a lot of ways to get around the oil price cap. And then what the West has done has been a big warning sign, a big wake-up call for everyone else. They've shown what we do. And I don't know if that is necessarily clearly acting as an effective deterrent, or if it's just acting as a kind of, here's what could happen to you. Now you've got a lot of time to prepare for it. It's going on for 2 years now. So more than that, it's a lot of waiting time.
Earlier in this episode, our listeners will have heard a report from the South China Sea, where our reporter was out on a Philippines Coast Guard boat being confronted by a Chinese Coast Guard boat aggressively to be warned off their territories. How have you seen other countries in Asia, other markets in Asia react to this news about the gold buying? Do we see shifts to protect themselves as well from some kind of potential upcoming conflict?
Well, yeah, it's very interesting. The World Gold Council data shows that central banks globally are on a record gold buying spree. China's having its own record, but central banks are also buying up huge amounts. And the largest chunk of growth is in emerging markets. So I think actually Turkey bought the most. Turkey's central bank bought the largest amount of gold at the start of the year. And, on the one hand, you can say, well, that's a country that is, obviously certainly in the middle. I don't know if I should say allied, but it's in the middle. It is still trading with Russia and things like that. But also in Turkey, there's this, that they're grappling with massive inflation. And that is another reason why central banks buy gold. It's not always just about skirting sanctions. So I think Turkey bought the most, then it was China, and then I think it was India. And there is a big story as well here about emerging markets, central banks and emerging economies buying up a lot of gold. And I think when I was talking to the World Gold Council, they were saying that's much more about this challenging the dominance of the dollar story. If you want to move away from using US dollars as a global reserve currency, as a kind of currency that you trade in, the interim there is you move into gold, because they're comparable things, right? And one can sort of be a substitute for another, I think, if you're in the mindset of central bank planning. Now, when we talk about moving de-dollarization, it's in very sort of soft early stages at the moment. I mean, the monopoly, the kind of hegemony of the dollar globally is just enormous. So, for example, outside of what central banks do, we can talk about US currency is used in half of global payments, according to SWIFT data, and the renminbi is used in less than 4%. So even though the renminbi is on a stratospheric rise, its use in trade finance has tripled in the last 3 years. The dollar's really dominant by so many multiples. But this kind of feeling of wanting to move away from that, I think it goes through gold first. And then maybe it's going to be quite a long time before central banks start buying large amounts of renminbi, because it's not easily convertible and China has a lot of capital controls. There is, the gold data does show also this story about emerging markets moving away from the beginnings of moving away from the dollar. It's in the very nascent stages.
Great, thank you so much. That's Melissa Lawford, economics reporter. That's all for Battle Lines this time. Please join us again next week for more of the Telegraph's best foreign reporting. Goodbye. Battle Lines is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our news, analysis and dispatches from around the world, subscribe to The Telegraph or sign up to Dispatches, which brings stories from our award-winning correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a live blog on our website where you can follow updates on Israel and Gaza as they come in throughout the day, including insight from contributors to this podcast. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app, and if you have a moment, leave a review, as it really helps others find the show. As disinformation is a particular problem during conflict, we are relying on your support more than ever. Battle Lines is part of wider Telegraph foreign coverage in our podcasts. If you're interested in finding out more about the war in Ukraine, you can listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. Battle Lines is produced by David Degahi, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.